I just can't believe how lucky I am to be in this room with you guys and watching this movie with a print that apparently made the projectionists well up with tears about how clean it was. So I'm very excited. When I was making the documentary about Paul, I actually saw this film bleary-eyed on COVID. And I was just like, I'd seen it when I was a kid on television a bunch of times, and I remembered it one way. And it came to me so completely new, and I fell in love with it, and I hope it plays well. I'm so excited to get to talk to Adam after it's over. I want to give you a little bit of where we are with Martin Ritt and Paul Newman. They've actually, at this moment, this is actually their 6th film together. Joanne Woodward had been in her first film, No Down Payment, which happens to be a great film too, and met Martin Ritt and introduced her to Paul. And then Long Hot Summer came along. That's where Paul and Joanne cemented their love affair. They made this, William Faulkner movie. They did Outrage, that Hemingway movie, some of ones that are a little forgettable. And Martin Ritt, when I was doing the documentary, I had this blessing of getting these long interviews that Paul had collected to prepare to write his memoir. He had his best friend Stuart Stern interview all their other friends about their life. And Martin Ritt is one of the most amazing interviews that I got to read in the whole process, because he's a really beautiful person. For those who don't know, he directed Sally Field to her Oscar in Norma Rae, Cicely Tyson and Sounder, James Earl Jones in The Great White Hope. He was blacklisted. He was an amazing director. In the interview, Stuart Stern, who's interviewed him, asked him, how come there's so many filmmakers where I feel like I see them, but I don't see you in these movies. I understand intellectually how you're there, and Martin Ritt talks very beautifully about getting inside a movie and getting inside the point of view of the story. And one of the reasons why he loved Paul in Ombre is that they had this meeting place. He compares like making great movies to really an act of faith, and he doesn't mean religious faith. He means a purity of faith in the belief and hope of playfulness of what could be. And Paul went down, he spent 2 weeks on a reservation trying to prepare for this. Paul struggled with this movie later in his life because he didn't feel like the politics lived up to what he imagined they could be. He loved Elmore Leonard. He loved the idea of this movie that it's always the best of us that have to take the bullet for the worst of us. And it seems to happen over and over again that we as a community, our best often have to fall before we wake up. And that's what he loved, and he felt like Marty kind of blew it, and Marty took that really personally. And in the interview, he's like, I don't know, he never worked with me again after Ombre. I mean, he thought Ombre was flawed. It's the best thing he ever did in his whole life. And Martin Ritt is so passionate. I was rereading the transcript this morning. Has nothing to do with Ombre, but I really have to tell you this story because it didn't make the documentary, and it's so good. I could never figure out where to go. Martin Ritt, lets you an idea of what world we're living in. Martin Ritt was blacklisted, and James Dean had just been cast in East of Eden, and Brando was giving him a hard time about accepting it, telling James Dean that he really regretted doing On the Waterfront, and that Gadge has got low character and you shouldn't do it. And so Martin Ritt met, I can't get over this. He met Brando and James Dean to play pool on 46th Street. And Brando was trying to talk James Dean out of not do East of Eden. And Brando didn't stay long apparently, and he leaves. And James Dean wanted to know what Martin Ritt thought. Like, is it okay to do this? And Martin Ritt didn't want to answer, as he tells. He just said, it's just not up to me. It's just, I just don't have an opinion. It's your life. I don't like this person's good, this person's bad. I don't know Gadge that well. He's a great artist. And in the middle of their conversation, James Dean just walked out. And then about 18 months went by, James Dean made the movie, and it was shortly before he died. They're in a snowstorm, and he's walking down the street, and James Dean walks by him and said, he made me a star, and kept walking. As if the conversation had never, Now, this has nothing to do with Ombre and Paul Newman, but it does paint the world of what these people were going through. And Marty Ritt was, for his time, a really beautiful thinker, and he loved Paul Newman, and they loved each other. They're lifelong friends afterwards. It's not true that Paul, I just said that they never worked together again, and Marty offered him a bunch of movies, and Paul offered Marty a bunch of movies. They just never fell in love with the same material again, but they were lifelong friends. And we'll talk about the movie afterwards, and there's a lot to say about it. Elmore Leonard, Paul Newman, let's do it. Ombre! What a hard movie to speak after, huh?
Hey, everyone. I think one thing I'd want to maybe start off with is if you can kind of maybe talk about this film in particular in the place of like Newman's filmography. And I mean, I know you'd kind of mentioned how it's his last collaboration with Martin Ritt, but yeah, what point does this sort of represent within his own career?
Gosh, it's interesting. When we started yesterday, I kind of front-loaded this series as a subtitle to this whole series, is Paul Newman's War with John Wayne, you know? And one of the things that in studying the life of another artist that's really interesting is the level of excellence that Paul Newman aspired for. And, you know, I think it was a very pivotal moment in his life, being a Jew and fighting World War II, and you know, we're 67 right here, and there's a huge awakening in the civil rights movement in the country. And you know, a year after this movie, a couple of years after this movie, I'm not exactly sure the timeline, but he'll work with Redford and their great friendship and Redford's awareness of the Native community, and they're both understood the power that their celebrity had. And I think Newman is seen as such a goy. He had a lot of internal shame about the way he looked and the way he came off to other people, and knowing his own family background, and really wanted to be, I mean, I think I told you this when we were on the phone, but it's a wonderful story that Johnny Carson gave up his show for a week to let Harry Belafonte be the host, and they couldn't get any white guests to come on. And just to understand where America is at this point. You know, Newman came on it like 4 times that week. And it was really important to him, and I think why he was frustrated with this movie as an older man is that he felt they could have done it better. He really liked this book a lot, and he held Marty Ritt to a very high standard. So it's not like he didn't like the movie, he just wanted it to be better. And it's one of the things, almost all the movies that he made, he felt that way about. It's kind of, some people when I was working the doc, would say, wow, he's so humble. And I kept saying, I don't think you actually understand. He's actually not humble. He actually, it's kind of, there's a humility to him in that he understands his place in the cosmos and the universe, and there isn't a lot of arrogance. But he aspired to a really high level of excellence, and I think it frustrated him in later years, feeling like they just could have done a portrait of Native. He thought there should have been more Native actors in it. Should Martin Balsam have played that part? You know, there's a lot of time teaches everybody things, and he was trying to be ahead of the curve in that way. And for those of you that weren't here, there's a funny story that a little bit before this time, Paul Newman walked into the commissary at Fox Studios. You know the story?
Yeah, you told me about it.
Yeah. And John Wayne said, "Hey Newman, how's the revolution coming?" And Newman just shouted back, "Be going a lot better, Duke, if you weren't on the wrong side." And so these westerns, in a lot of ways, are, you know, and Judge Roy Bean and Buffalo Bill and HUD are about reminding people what the reality of, trying to remind the reality of the Western to the best of their ability. Where do you think mean, you've studied this too. Where do you think it falls? I mean, what did you think while you watched it?
Yeah, I think watching it this time around, especially on, I think also I want to give a huge shout out to Austin Film Society. I know.
Thank you so much.
As I'm sure many of you have, read things in the past couple of weeks, having this type of projection is a true gift. And I think, showing this film on film is something that cannot be replicated anywhere. So again, I just want to give a shout out to everybody here. I want to give a shout out to Rick, Holly, everybody here who's made this space, and also Ethan for, showing these films.
Thank you so much. I've seen this movie a bunch of times. And there's a shot of like the pond, a little pool, and you see a little frog swimming across it. I've never seen that frog. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah. And it's like, in watching it this way, I think, again, there were things I picked up this time around in particular. I think, even historically, I think when you have a lot of these revisionist Westerns where, the Native community becomes sort of this cipher for what was going on in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And I think with this, what's really interesting is I think in a lot of ways, because it is sort of this, I think I told you about it, I have my own kind of take on part of this film where it's almost sort of like this anti-stagecoach, where instead of all the people in the stagecoach show their best coming out at the end, this is about how more awful they are by the end.
It's so awful when she's saying Alex.
Yeah. I mean, and everybody's so just awful. Staying there. Yeah. So I think it's like, but I think what I noticed is, like, in particular, I think with the lack of any sort of like Native presence in there, is that it's much more about the people that it's showing on the screen. And I think it's, in reading the book as well too, I got to read the book this past week. It's like, I think Leonard's take, I think, and I get what you're saying with the Newman thing. I think his vision of it was probably closer to what the Leonard book was like, where it was much more of an indictment on sort of like white culture. Mm-hmm. A lot of those characters are much more racist in the book, and I think this, obviously I get it, it's a studio film, they had to kind of soften it to, show it to the majority of the country, who happen to be white, in terms of how they would take it. But I think this one, I think it's much more. It's a bit more about like kind of like the home front, if that makes sense, versus like trying to, say that the Apache, which there are a number of Westerns where essentially they sort of make that correlation of like the Apache being like, the Vietnamese and things like that. And I think it's interesting because, again, it's much more of like, I think Newman and Ritt putting a mirror back to the audience of the time, I think. And I think maybe that was part of the reason of why it didn't land as well as probably Newman wanted it to. But I don't know. Like, how do you feel about that in particular?
Well, sociopolitically is one thing. As a work of drama, which is where my any bit of qualifications to speak about, come out. I find it. There's a thing in Marty Ritt's interview about Paul Newman that's so interesting. Is he talks. He's a very long-winded man, Marty Ritt. It's really fun to read because he talks about anything. Like he'll get him on the subject of talent. What is talent? He starts talking about matter and atoms and light in the intersection of energy and matter and the space between the smallest particle and the next to smallest particle is the equivalent of the distance of the Earth to the moon. That's how little we understand about matter. And when you get somebody who's talented in space and time to intersect, it's magic, and that life is magic. And he talks very beautifully about friendships, and that good art is made through intimacy, and intimacy is born of friendships, and our job is to hold a mirror up to nature. And then he says, but what our real job is to show everybody the back of the mirror. He's like, what's on the other side of the mirror? And he says, and that's where spirit lives. And that to try to get at some spirit, and I think that if we talked about it as a socio-political thing, and I'm just speaking, I think they're talking to white people.
Yeah, no, I think so.
I mean, and they're having a very intelligent dialogue with white people, and we're trying to wake them up at a place where they are available to be woken up from the inside. Meaning, I find it fascinating that Newman's character, the classic John Wayne Western, John Wayne, the bad guy would walk in and demand the guy's seat. And John Wayne said, "The hell you would get," he'd get in a fight right there because he's a good person. In this movie really asks you, like, what is a good person? You know, I mean, in a sense, the I don't remember the name of the actress's name, but she's amazing. The redhead, I just love her character.
Oh yeah, the Diane Salento.
Is that who it is? Louis, is it? Yeah, she's amazing in the movie, and yet she gets Newman killed, right? I mean, by trying to be a good person, and this way in which we all justify our actions and how self-interested we all are. And you get the sense that Newman's character says, all right, if one of these people will be willing to go down, I'll do it for them. And that's kind of heartbreaking. But there isn't no character is one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you get the feeling that actually Newman would run off with that money if they hadn't caught up to him.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's interesting too because I think with that, I think of like Newman's work, and I'm sure you came across this too, of how he sort of used that term, like he would try to play these characters that, and this one's a little bit, I think, of almost kind of an inverse where it's all the characters around him and he's kind of at the center, versus he would play these characters that would have everything that, like, I think an American audience or larger audiences would sort of see as having all of the ingredients for something of success or virtue, like somebody who is very good looking, somebody who is going forward, but they had what he called the seeds of corruption. Yeah. And that was the thing that, like, by the end, like HUD's a little bit different, but I mean, you have these other films where he starts off in one place and by the end he's kind of this bastard that you hate. And I think with this in particular, he's a bit of a neutral character in a really interesting way, in the way that he is able to bring this mirror to all of these characters, and all of the characters essentially are corrupt by the end. And I think a lot of what you were saying as well too, I think that, I would imagine Newman spending time, being the actor studio actor that he was in terms of his preparation, like as he was known, spending time on that reservation to prepare for this role, that I think that I'm sure that, like, with this argument that is going on in the film of essentially the idea of complicity, or how close are we all to some level of complicity to, like, theft to some extent. I think that that's something that he was, I take from this, that he was kind of trying to get to. But
I think that's what's very moving about it, is how we all allow a society to rob and mistreat others as long as it doesn't affect us. And of course, it does end up affecting us all the time. And our interconnectivity is made obvious through a long life. But when the young man says at the beginning, I'm not worried about tomorrow, I'm worried about now. We're all worried about right now. I want to get to the dinner as quick as possible, so I don't mind driving right now. I'm hungry right now, so I will eat this food what I need right now, and not thinking about the long-term ramifications of our actions. Everybody's playing checkers, as opposed to the Newman character is playing a little bit chess. He's always kind of reminding, and what do you think will happen when you do X? And then Y will happen, and then what will we do? He's so wonderfully practical the whole time, like that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because in the book, the majority of the whole story is told through the Billy character. Oh, and I think they fixed some of that character's kind of like passivity in the book, with him having like a wife and coming along. But I think that they really get into the book of, like, which is interesting, because you reading the book, seeing it this way, I can read it differently from than how I saw it the first time, of how he starts to figure out that it's the John Russell character who essentially in his mind is not going down there, because he's like, if it's one person that goes down there, they're going to get everybody else killed. And so that's part of the other thing too, where again, it's like, to what you were saying, it's like the idea of playing who's playing checkers, who's playing chess, but also the larger picture, even beyond that, where they're in that shack at the end, and he says that, like, there's a whole group of people just out there, and it's like, it's the same thing with, I think, all of us. It's like there are communities all around us, or the next town over that I think it's very easy just to, it's out of sight, out of mind, whether however intentional or not intentional that is. And I think it's, again, that plays, I think, also into, I know we kind of talked about that a little bit of like, of Ritt's films as well, especially how he's always sort of drilling into it's always a larger indictment of like a larger hypocrisy, I guess you could say. It's
interesting, like the Martin Balsam character has that wonderful moment when they ask him to kick Newman out from writing inside. And his first reaction is it's just embarrassment for the person. He says, he tells him to go wash his hands. And I mean, he shows some integrity, but it's easier, isn't it? And he buys Newman some mezcal and just kind of talks about, isn't it easier to move with the river? Yeah. It's always just a little, just right now. And then so quickly, when the power dynamics are shifted, then Newman gets the power because he's the only one that knows the way home. Then everybody all of a sudden isn't racist, you know?
Yeah.
And it's my mother, it's a little apropos of nothing, but maybe it relates. My brain just went, my mother for 20 years worked for gypsy rights in Eastern Europe and was trying to teach the more affluent community in Bucharest that if they don't make these kids that they don't like, these gypsy kids, if they don't make them go to preschool, like if they don't go to nursery school and first grade and second grade and third grade, you can't just like make them start school in sixth grade. It's not going to go well. They haven't learned the rules of classroom. And she just kept having to say, like, don't you understand that if you don't give these young people an education, what do you think they're going to do when they're 18? Right? What do you think all these kids are going to do? It's not rocket science, right? They're going to be impoverished with no education. They're going to grow up. And so you're asking, like, why did these part of the community? Why is there theft? Why is there drug abuse? Why is there prostitution? Why are they stealing televisions? Like, they didn't go to school. What do you think? It's just trying to show people their interconnectivity. Like, it is going to negatively impact your life. It's to your best interest to provide a good educational system in your long-term benefit. I don't know why, but the movie makes you think about things like that.
No, I do, and I think it's like this film, in a really great way, it's for the 2-hour runtime, it's them kicking the can down the road the entire time until it gets to the very end, and it's like, I think it offers a solution, but I think a solution that is as sort of smart as it deals with everything, in the sense that the solution is that once John Russell realized that he had a chance to go give the money back, which is the whole thing of what he was doing and not telling people, is that it's, I think, Newman and Ritt's way of saying, in terms of like a larger history of, American genocide with indigenous people, of like, we have to give back what's of value that we've taken back to these people that, again, are sort of impoverished, very much kept out of sight, out of mind, are seen as sort of these savages that eat dogs, and nobody questions why they're eating dogs, in the first place. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, there are these, these monsters out there that, we're helping through Indian agents and things like that.
Totally corrupt Indian
exactly,
agent.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's like, I do think it's interesting because, again, it's like, it is something kind of to what you're saying. It's like, it's human nature to want to try to just keep kicking the can down the road. And it's the hardest thing to do is to, once we have the solution, is, as much as everybody wants to like walk around it, is, it doesn't seem like the easy thing to do, but that's what so that's my own theory of why this film is a land back movie to some extent.
Is it what?
A land back movie.
Yeah, it feels that way.
Yeah.
You get the sense that young man is going to bring that money. You get the feeling you get. My question watching it this time is, what do you think they were preparing us for with the horses in the beginning? Because there's some definite analogy to that horse that was trying to help its herd and ended up getting them all caught. But it was an impossible situation. They needed the water, but it was a trap. And that, you remember, it's a very kind of mystical opening, and beautiful. And I'm not, it's trying to do something to our brain to let us see this movie as a metaphor, I think.
I think so too, and also too, that is something that is not in the book, so that must have just been from the screenwriters, which is a whole other thing too. We can get into them at some point, but I think it's like, yeah, I think it's kind of to what you were saying. I think it's alluding to a larger kind of herd mentality of both kind of around necessity, but then also, you know, what happens when that gets flipped around. I mean, that's my thought on it. But
I know, and it's hard not to see this movie in context of the year it came out. You know, in a hair's breadth, Martin Luther King's going to be killed, Malcolm X is going to be killed. You know, it's like there is this feeling of good people putting themselves in danger to try to wake the herd up.
Well, Martin Ritt too. I mean, with him being blacklisted and things like that. I mean, I'm sure that was something that he was definitely thinking of in that scene.
Very much on his mind, and that was the source of friendship between those two guys, as they saw this medium as an opportunity. If you could make meaningful, substantive art without having an agenda with your audience other than the truth, you know, I mean, you know, Norman Ray's a great Union movie if you're interested in Union, but it's a very compelling human drama. I mean, you know, she's a very dynamic character, and the movie works, and it doesn't feel like it's just trying to like get you to sign up for the Union. It's trying to.
Yeah, and I think it's again too, kind of going back to the Leonard adaptation, where it's like, you know, I mean, I don't think. He's always known for writing these really great scenes of tension, and like that's what his books kind of are. There's not necessarily, I would say, like an overarching. It probably doesn't have the same message that I think Ritt and them have, which is probably why I think they softened some of the larger indictment of just the characters being, you know, these racists and things like that. Because it is, I think, Ritt and Newman sort of extending their hand to the audience to try to think differently, you know, rather than just sort of pointing the finger at them and then, you know, telling them to get out. So, yeah.
I think Spike Lee would have been more aggressive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think he would have been as gentle.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. I agree. I think like a question I have for you with this is like within sort of, how would I put this? Like the thing that's really interesting, I think, with Newman's Westerns is that he's never playing the classic kind of center of what Westerns were, like in the sense that he's never really a cowboy. He's always like an outlaw. He is, you know, in The Outrage, he's playing this Mexican outlaw. And with this as well too, he's somebody who was raised a captive, who's somewhere between white and native society and stuff like that. How do you feel like this sort of plays into his larger ideas of that?
I think he was just hell-bent to kind of undo the myth of the white American male. I think, HUD, what we're going to see next is a great example of it. Martin Ritt talks a lot about, you know, if he had cast Jack Palance as HUD, the movie would have completely, he's like, I love Jack Palance, but you would have, like, Jack Palance you would have known he was a bad guy. There's the thing about beauty. He calls it the unity of opposites. That's what he talks about. Like, you know, why Zero Mostel is so funny is because he's graceful and overweight. And it's the unity of opposites. And Paul is so beautiful. And when he plays malevolent soul, you actually, it's like a ballerina dancing or something. Your brain can't make sense out of why these two opposite things could work. And it's how a lot of bad things happen in the world, is through the disguise of charisma, through the disguise of beauty. We are all, you know, perennially in high school and want the cool kids to like us. And so if you sense, you know, and so Newman, I think has this wonderful quality, and a lot of his favorite parts. When you say, what parts does he love? He loves himself in Slapshot. He loves himself in Judge Roy Bean. He loves to play characters. I think Buffalo Bill is his most personal. It's like him screaming to the world. That's why some people, I think, don't like the movie. It's a self-portrait of movie stars are fake. Don't believe it. Buffalo Bill is a lie. It's a lie. I'm a lie. Redford's a lie. McQueen is a lie. We're not that cool. Stop it. You know? And it's some part of him, obviously he had this amazing career and obviously he loved it, but some part of him was allergic to the hero worship that he was receiving. And I think that's why the giving was so intense, you know, what he did financially and with his time. But it was him, he loved to play parts like HUD because he's like, don't trust it. Don't trust it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think I know we had talked about that. And I think that I'd read this thing from, I think it was 76, where he had said at that time his favorite films, I think, were Hemingway's Adventures of a Young Man and The Outrage. And part of it was, I think, the way that I took it was like, he's not really in Hemingway's Adventures of a Young Man. And then in The Outrage, you know, he's under all this makeup and he doesn't even look like himself. And where it's kind of to what you were saying, where I think he has an interesting thing of being able to kind of like bury himself in the film to some degree, or he's able to sort of like use his own looks as a weapon to some extent. That's
what he liked to do. And he was much more comfortable in the character parts, even before he was good at them. Like late in life, he got very good at playing character parts, like what's the Hudsucker Proxy and stuff. He's wonderful in some of these smaller parts where he gets to play. And
Road to Perdition too.
Yeah, Road to Perdition. I mean, he's wonderful in Road to Perdition, and he was always uncomfortable with playing the John Wayne part. Yeah. He didn't like saying, I'm handsome and I'm going to save the day. He wouldn't mind saying, I'm handsome and I'm a horrible son of a bitch. You know? Yeah. And I think part of why people responded the way they did to Butch Cassidy, for example, is he just every now and then let himself be likable. You know, just unadulterated, like I'm just, and that's why that film's not included in the series, because it does not support my narrative.
Well, I'm curious too, because it's like, you know, going a little bit further back to sort of the beginning of Newman's career, you know, there was always because he came out of the actor's studio and, you know, just given sort of the generation he was in, he was always very early on being compared to Brando, James Dean, and to an extent, like, you know, Montgomery Clift. Yeah. I also think that in some ways, at a certain point, you know, somewhat fairly early on, he does start to, you know, sort of carve his own persona or kind of character in terms of his work. But it's hard to see any of those three guys playing these types of characters.
I think this was a break. This is around the moment. It's like, this is very close to Cool Hand Luke, where he started to find who Paul Newman was, and he starts to shed all the superficial elements of what the method was teaching him. And like, if anybody notices, the actor in me is, the body language is exquisite in this movie.
It's all physicality in this.
What he communicates, the guy has 15 lines in this movie. He has about 8 lines in Cool Hand Luke. And he got very, very, and the body language in these two movies, is Cool Hand Luke and Ombre, is completely different. I mean, he's very, very good at, he was an athlete. He loved sports, and he loved the use, you know, the use of the human body as a tool, as the performer. And I find it so inspiring. In one of the other transcripts that I didn't get to use in the doc was a Gore Vidal transcript. It's like, you know, he's always, people say, you know, Newman, oh, he's good, but he's not really acting. You know, like, and it's just what it is the highest compliment. You always, there's a joke I have with my friends that anytime you win an award for acting, it means you completely fucked up. You know, because if you won an award for it, obviously you were acting up a big old storm, and they didn't believe you. You know, obviously they thought, oh, you know, wow, he did great, pretending. The really great ones, it's like, you just think, wow, Paul Newman's just awesome. But he's not Paul Newman. That's Ombre, you know, and it's different than Cool Hand Luke. All his characters feel connected to the essence of him, but they're not like each other. There's shades, and you know, he's turning the angles of his body in such a way so that they catch a different light. and each character is different. And I feel it was around this period where he started really getting comfortable in his own skin. And I do think that Martin Ritt, his belief in him, his intelligence, Martin Ritt talks a lot about, they had a really good experience on the Long Hot Summer, and they went to do Paris Blues, and Paul was just a wreck around Poitier and around Joanne. He just felt they were so much looser and so much more natural. And then through HUD, he's still got a little Monty Clift. There's still a little Elia Kazan's teaching in there that you see. But you see it gets shed in this time period, and we start to get who Paul, what is unique about Paul Newman in cinema in this movie.
No, definitely. I'm also curious too, because going to sort of, especially his collaborations with Ritt, I'm curious if, in all of your research and stuff, did he ever mention anything about working with James Wong Howe? Because, with this too, I think it's also some of the more striking images of Newman were shot by him. And I think it also ties into the larger kind of idea of both Ritt and I think Newman working with and working with people, or at least highlighting folks from more marginalized communities, which I know there could be a whole other series, Austin Film Society, on James Wong Howe.
and he deserves it. I mean, I was watching these images. We've seen so many Westerns. We've seen the iconography, the absolute simplicity of how they create cinema. And I don't even know what that word means. Sometimes somebody can write a sentence and it's a sentence. And sometimes there's another person, Emily Dickinson writes a sentence and it's poetry. And there are people with a camera, and the combination between a good director and a good actor and a brilliant cinematographer, I was blown away by the absolute simplicity of what we're looking at. And that's another reason why I'm so grateful for this print. See, it feels like we're there on opening weekend, and to see the way everybody looks and the way the images tell the story, and even the little bar, I forget what it was called right now, but they never tried too hard. And HUD is the same way. And I wonder, when you said, did he tell any stories? I wish he spoke more about James Wong Howe. But there is a really funny story, which is that they were all on set and out in the middle of the desert, and they were all at the commissary. And the day before, Newman had tried, there was the caterers were Mexican, and they put out some jalapeno peppers, and Newman had one, and he loves spicy food. He talks about in his journal, he's like, I love spicy food, and I literally I wanted to put a fire truck in my mouth. I wanted to kill myself. It was so hot. And the next day, Sean Connery showed up on set because he wanted Joanne, who was visiting Paul, to be in a movie with him, and he came to sit at the commissary, and they're having a meeting, it's like, they're just sitting at the table, all having lunch, and Newman's like, I wonder if he's going to eat one of these peppers, And apparently, Connery is in the middle of a story, takes one of these peppers, pops it in his mouth, chews it, keeps telling him, no effect. And Newman's just watching him. He takes another one, pops it in. He's just looking. He just goes, who is Sean Connery? He's the toughest man alive. That's what popped in my head. It's not about James Wong Howe, but I love that story.
I guess both in terms of this, we'll open it up to questions after this, but in terms of this series, or even in terms of Newman's filmography, his work, how would you want people to see this film or to take away from it?
I love movies that surprise you with their humanity, and there's something about the way that lead female character speaks that is so surprising. The dialogue is so funny and interesting, and each character has some moment that you recognize some humanity in. And the kind of inherent drama when you can create that magic that movies can do, where somehow they start they start to feel like a living metaphor. When you see all those people trapped in the room and them turning the woman who's so arrogant, I wouldn't eat dog and blah, blah, blah. And there she is, tied down and dying and humiliated. And so, do you have empathy for her? I don't know. Why? And I love what it does to your brain. And the kid and the Martin Balsam character, who you kind of like, but ultimately just wants to get through life. And he's kind of worried about God, but not sure about it. And the intellectual, who's definitely sure there's not, he's got everything under control, and he completely doesn't have anything under control. And there's this mystery that is unlocked. And I have to say, when I watched it, I was like, there is a little piece of the back of the mirror in this movie. Whatever that means. It's a little, it makes you, like, I get it. There's aspects of it that are made in its time period, and hopefully if it was made now, there'd be certain things that would be, but I felt proud of them, and I felt proud that I think it's worth watching because it always makes me think. And I think it's interesting how history sometimes takes some works of art and elevates them to this hyperbolic point and kind of forgets other ones. And one of the things I love about our time together here today is just this moment of revisiting our past. And it really does, my hope with this festival is if Newman and that generation was kind of taking the Western away from, Clint Eastwood's doing his versions, and they're trying to take it away from the John Waynes and Jimmy Stewarts and all those guys and what they were doing. And with Yellowstone coming out now, and you feel like the people are interested in the Western, what are we doing with the Western now? It is our American, it's one of, jazz. We have a few art forms that are American, and what are we doing with them? Mm-hmm. And I wonder if this generation is going to be the generation to make a movie this good, but actually have it star a guy with brown eyes. Mm-hmm. Can we make that leap? Mm-hmm. Are we there yet? I don't know. Could we tell a story? I've always, my whole life is I'd love to see a Western that is, I have a, you take a movie called Geronimo, right? And it stars Robert Duvall, Gene Hackman, Jason Patric, and Matt Damon. And
West Studi.
And West Studi. And I always thought, what if you made Malcolm X and it starred Robert Duvall, Gene Hackman, Jason Patric, and Denzel Washington as Malcolm X? That's weird, But nobody even there's an awakening we all feel happening, but there's a push and a pull about it, and we're in the middle of our own time period, and I find it very valuable to go back and go, okay, 1967. This was happening, that was happening, this is what they made, what do you think? And let your brain riff on that and how that could affect, what are we saying about the time we're living in? Mm-hmm. It makes my brain work in a way that I enjoy, and I hope it does for other people as well. Should we do some questions?
Yes, do some questions. We'll call on you. Yes.
Should I just ask, I have separate questions for both of you, but should I just pick one?
Sure.
You be you, as Ombre would say. Yeah. You do your thing.
Yeah.
I will then. Mm-hmm. So, as a representative of somebody in the film industry and as an individual, how do you feel about modern representation in the genre film? Examples like Blood Quantum, which comes from people actually from that community, and kind of bringing history into it. Like, what if there was a new virus where the indigenous people were immune to smallpox, or films like Prey, which was a widespread release where they actually dubbed the Comanche language into the film. Do you think that that is a path forward, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the question was around genre films, I guess specifically from an indigenous standpoint, do they seem like a path forward for stuff? I think there's two parts to that question. I think there just needs to be more indigenous people working in the film industry, especially with those stories, being at some level of it, with the producers of Prey, they were indigenous, or even with Blood Quantum, a native director. I think that stuff's great. I also think, which I'm all for, I work also with this collective of indigenous artists where we specifically support and fund experimental and avant-garde film by indigenous filmmakers. I think we also need to, through that, this is also like kind of the second part to that question. I think that we do need to be making stuff that's also kind of centers Indigenous audiences and like everyone else's welcome, in the same way that like you would see like an Ozu film in Japan and you wouldn't be like, why is this not speaking to me as an American? You know what I mean? Like, I think that's something that I'm particularly interested in. And I think a lot of folks have been doing that. And in terms of like a larger idea of Indigenous cinema, I think one that is somewhat independent outside of a larger industry, but I also think that there absolutely needs to be people working within the industry and, you know, shepherding some of those stories and telling their own stories through that. So if that answers your question on that. So,
It does. And
yeah.
why do you think Ozu cut to the base, since you mentioned him?
I have no idea.
A lot of big fights about that.
Yeah. But that's just my thought on it. But yeah, so.
Thank you. When you were doing the last movie stars, did you have an overarching narrative in mind before you read the transcripts that kind of evolved through everyone else's voice, or did you let it speak for itself?
Just asking about, when making the last movie stars, I had no plan. I had a plan of making one feature-length documentary, and it just spun out of control. Yeah, so it just evolved as it went. I realized that their lives were too big, two people, 50-year careers. As Scorsese said, I got the unbelievable good fortune to get to interview him. And he's like, if you take from Three Faces of Eve to Mr. and Mrs. Bridge for Joanne's career alone, you span a huge part of cinema. And to also talk about marriage and love and what celebrity means and what your relationship as an individual versus a political self and all those things. Their lives got, Newman has a line in Color of Money, sometimes you got to go slow to go fast. And that became my mantra for the documentary. I think this is actually a lot more interesting if I go a little bit slower. So it just evolved.
Yes. The white, yeah, right there. Yeah.
If you could take one Western out of the canon that you don't think deserves that status, and take another one, this doesn't count because it's famous enough, but take like another one that you think is overlooked and replace it, what would that be? I know that's high pressure, but if anything comes to mind.
Well, does it have to star Paul Newman?
No.
Here, Rick introduced me years ago to a Gregory Peck film called The Gunfighter, which I think is one of the most overlooked, brilliant Westerns, one of the most perfect Westerns of all time. And again, like this one, it works as a little play. It's like a myth, a legend about, it makes you think about morality. And I like Westerns that do that. They kind of operate, you take the desert and human beings, and we can see our behavior in these very isolated ways.
In The Mask, yeah.
So one of my favorite things about Westerns, and I was definitely thinking about The Gunfighter during this, is looking at interdependence versus independence. And a lot of times, like the archetype of the gunfighter, and it applies here with Newman, where I think the movie does seem to admire his independence and kind of look down on the rest of the group for their inability to take care of themselves in the way that Newman can. But that's one of my favorite things about End of the West Westerns is deconstructing that and showing that actually it's the interdependent people that survive. But I was curious about what your take on this movie's view of that is, because it really does seem to quite admire Newman's agency in a different way that he has in a different way to some of the other characters.
Well, there is a certain, they don't overdo it, but there's a certain Christ metaphor at work at the end, that he dies for others, right? And I think he definitely could have taken the money and ridden off. That Ombre is fully capable of doing, and he didn't do that. And he was haunted by his interconnectivity. He wouldn't feel right about doing that in some way. So he wasn't that independent. I mean, I just think the question is part of what Martin Ritt wants us to be talking about. You know, I mean, I don't think there is an answer to that. You make me think of one of my favorite. There's, you know, he recently passed, but a Vietnamese monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, right? You know, the question is not to be or not to be. The question is to interbe. If we could all interbe, we should not ask ourselves the question. I'm doing a bad Thich Nhat Hanh impersonation, and now I'll be canceled. But I found it really charming and really wonderful. And the idea, you know, the American mythos is all about the individual. I mean, if we could talk about gun rights and car, we really like the individual, and yet we're made constantly aware. I mean, there's no, even whether we're talking about masks or vaccines, you know, this question of interdependence and dependence and what are my rights and what is infringing on my rights is just a huge American debate. You remember in Star Trek, it was always the thing, like Spock was always thinking the greater good, and Kirk was so American, like, yeah, but Spock, it's me and you, buddy. You know, we got to look after each other. And you kind of loved them both, because we're magnetically drawn to, I want my own car, I want my own horse, I want my own life, I'm a lone wolf, right? You know, we gravitate to this idea, and yet we're lost without each other. And so I think this story makes you think like that, like, well, it really wouldn't have been right for Hero to wander off by himself. We wouldn't have admired that in him. And I don't know what the right way for them to have played their situation is. You know, I mean, that's one of the things I think the script does really well is I don't think she should send him down there with the money. If they just wait up there, nothing good's going to happen. More bad guys are going to come. They have to make a move, and somehow you kind of know Newman's going to get killed when he goes down there, and you kind of figure he knows it too, and that's somehow moving. The herd loves it when one of us says, I'll take the fall so you can all go free. You know, we all really admire that, and we'll give you a statue, but you'll be dead. You know, so I just think your question is the question of the movie. I don't think I could answer that. It'd be fun to have some pie and talk about it.
Yes, sir.
This gets back to the last movie stars. I noticed that it said season 1, and that got me excited about.
They always do that. I don't know. They just have to give it like a category or something. I don't understand that. It would be so fun. I wish like HBO would do another season and do. Well, you know, a great Poitier doc came out, but there's so many interesting artists of the past that are worth. You know, James Wong Howe. I mean, this guy's story is incredible. And there's on Criterion. They have a little.
I think there's a series up still, right?
Yeah, that you can check out. The guy who shot this movie and shot HUD in his remarkable career and the racism that he faced and what he accomplished. He was a true trailblazer, and there's so many interesting people that we can learn from their lives. But if it was a season 2, it would have to be directed by somebody else because that was exhausting. Well, thank you so much for saying that. One of the things that meant a lot to me about doing it was if we were going to do a biography of Edvard Munch or something like that, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but a painter, and then you'd see these paintings and people would say, oh, this painting was inspired, you know, he's from this part of the world and he was suffering with this illness and he was having an addiction issue and that's what this represents. And that. But people think because we play characters that somehow we're not using ourselves in our art. And I had this idea of like, well, if I was going to do a biography of actors, I would try to show how the humanity in a great performer is they're accessing something real. And so I have this, I always know for myself, whenever I want to do a role or commit myself to a role, and whenever sometimes I don't do it, for various reasons, but when a role is meaningful to me and I do a good job, it's always personal. Because Anne always said, you got to sneak a little of blood in the mercury, in the silver nitrate there of the film. You got to give people a reason to pay their money and a little piece of something that means a lot to you. And I started looking at all these movies and going, all right, why did Paul Newman want to make Ombre? And like really looking, and then we would try to find the clips that illuminated, and I'll tell you, when Paul Newman wanted to give that speech about being a Christian, he wanted to do that on camera, I guarantee it. He wanted to say that line on film and put it in the movie theaters across America, and he did. And it was a small victory, But so I hunted for that with all those movies. It's like, where is he? Where does he live?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I have a question for you. I'm thinking of films like Eat, Drink, Man, Woman or Passion Fish, and I'm wondering, do you think it's possible to make a Western where there's not any weapons and no one gets killed?
Oh, there's been a bunch of them. I mean, well, I shouldn't say a bunch. My brain is going like,
They're out there.
there really are. There's a lot of them. They usually don't get called Westerns if they don't have a gun. But there's a lot of ones that involve the landscape and.
Like Heartland, or is that what you think?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of a lot of older movies. There's a lot of. They're usually advertised more to a female audience. Some of those old female-driven movies, those old, Katharine Hepburn movies and stuff. I'm trying to think but it's a great look. Something. One of the greatest honors of my life and failures of my life are the same thing. When I was 30 years old, I was at. This will actually answer your question. I was at some event, and the great Roger Ebert was there. Some dinner party, and apropos of nothing, Roger Ebert clicks his glass and he says, I want to make a toast to Ethan Hawke, who has the most successful film career without ever killing anyone on screen. and I was really honored, and I knew I just had killed somebody on screen, and it just hadn't come out yet, And he gave a great speech about the problem. One of the problems with movies is, and one of the problems with big business usurping the art form. That's why I really liked you talking about the avant-garde and where creativity and human creativity can still be alive in this art form is big business learned quickly that guns photograph really well. And Roger Ebert was saying this, if you want to get people's attention in the first 5 minutes of a movie, show a dead woman or a gun, and people start watching. And it doesn't mean it's any good. It doesn't mean it's worth watching. It's insulting to, but it's playing right to the lizard that lives in the back of your brain, So the question is not really, is there any Westerns without guns or anything? Are there any movies without, there's very few movies that don't glorify certain elements, and because it's extremely useful to getting asses in seats. So, but I've dedicated a lot of my life of making them without it. I just also have to pay my bills, and there's a direct correlation between how much you get paid and whether you carry a gun.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, this may be too broad, but I was really interested in the women in this film.
Me too.
And the main character basically spends the entire time worrying about everybody else, like trying to save Billy's marriage, trying to get the sheriff to marry her, trying to help Paul Newman, and nobody is looking out for her. And she saves the woman as she's sexually assaulted. And then at the end, she reverts back to whiteness, and trying to save favor, and then has to sit there at the end to blame, like you said,
isn't it? It's a little bit more complicated than that because you actually admire her. She is the only one willing to do it herself. You know, and so I think blame is too. I don't blame her. I walk away from the movie going, God, the world sucks. Like because there doesn't seem any way to exactly play the riddle where it's obvious. I mean, she's the only one who's willing to walk down there. And, you know, her plan was not to not have the money in there. She was going to walk down there with the money in there. And yes, they probably would have killed him. But Newman changed, you know, Ombre changes the plan and says, it's more important to me than this money get where it's supposed to go. And so he is complicit in his own death. Had he actually given them the money, he probably could have backed up, got out of there. But once he knows they're going to open that up, he knows he's walking down there for a gunfight. She wasn't doing that. So I don't think the movie is attacking. We're all walking away thinking about that actor's performance, and that's a very good thing that the filmmaker did for us. I mean, we are designed to see ourselves in her. I mean, isn't it when she kind of basically proposes to that dipshit sheriff who ends up being overly, I mean, she's so charming. I mean, how else can I debase myself? You know, I mean, she's so funny. You know, I let you do what you want, da 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 da, and she's working it. Widow at 19. You know, I mean, the feeling is she's the only one who's likable. Ombre is unknowable. He's a mythic status, right? You know, he's powerful in a way. You know, why's he got to shoot the guy when they're riding away? You know, he's got some water and he's got his rifle. Disappear. Get them all out of there. He's got to poke. You know, I mean, so I'm not sure the movie's saying what you think it's saying there at the end. She is, in a way, in a more complicated way, it's the only other people that were actually willing to help that get punched in the face and get blamed. Yeah. You know, I mean,
yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I was going to say, you know, from reading the book, her character actually didn't exist in the book. There was another character that was a woman character that the Billy character, who's the narrator, kind of has a crush on and keeps trying to get with her. She's very sort of standoffish, and you find out that essentially she is going back to her family after having been captured by the Apaches for a few months. But this character, they essentially got rid of that character, I think, created this character. I think because in the book, which you also kind of see in the film, there's a certain sort of like impenetrability to Ombre. And I think that character is a bit more of trying to be like the audience is conscious and stuff like that. That's the way that I took it, at least. Yeah. But I think it's it is interesting that she's a construction for the film in itself.
And I think it's really interesting. I think she is supposed to be us, all of us, male, that we all think we would walk down with the money, but we're all willing to let somebody else do it if they will, where it takes us a little too long to get around to it, but we're all, I mean, she's the only one we kind of relate to, all of us. And so it's a really good question. And I really had I'm so grateful to have you here to talk with about this. I'm so grateful that you guys all came. It's so fun to have this dialogue with everybody and to watch this great movie.
Yeah, we'll stick around for...
All right, stick around for HUD.
Yeah, see ya.
All right.